The sound of sirens pierced the air, breaking the tranquility of the neighborhood. Alice was outside, kicking a makeshift soccer ball around when the police cars came to a screeching halt in front of their small house. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, curiosity pulling them to their doors. Alice stopped playing, her heart pounding as the officers stepped out of the car and marched towards her. "Are you Alice Harvey?" one of the officers asked, his voice stern. Alice nodded, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Yes, sir. What's going on?" Before she could get an answer, another officer took out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the theft of a diamond belonging to Mrs. Victoria Murphy," he said, snapping the cuff onto her small wrist. The weight of those cold metal cuffs felt like the world crashing down on her. She could barely breathe as she struggled to understand. "But I didn't steal anything," she whispered, her voice shaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, but the officers didn't care. They led her towards the police car without another word. David rushed out of the house, his face pale with shock. "Wait. Stop. What are you doing to my daughter?" His voice broke as he ran toward them, but the officers pushed him back gently. "She's just a child. She didn't do anything wrong." "We have a warrant, sir," the officer said bluntly. "She's been accused of stealing a valuable diamond from Mrs. Murphy's house. We have to take her in." David's heart sank. He knew this was impossible. Alice had been with him the whole time she was supposedly at the Murphy mansion. She could never have stolen anything. But his protests fell on deaf ears. The officers continued dragging Alice away, and the neighbors' whispers began to grow louder. The familiar faces that once greeted them warmly were now twisted with suspicion, judging both Alice and her father without even knowing the full story. David watched helplessly as Alice was shoved into the back of the police car. Her tear-streaked face pressed against the window, looking back at him with eyes full of fear. He ran after the car, his legs burning with every step, but it was no use. The car sped off, taking his little girl away from him. He stood in the middle of the street, breathing heavily, his fists clenched in frustration. "She didn't do it," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "She didn't do it." The whispers from the neighbors grew louder. People started stepping out of their houses, muttering things like, "Did you hear what happened?" and "Who would have thought the little girl would do something like that?" David felt their eyes on him, sharp like daggers, cutting into him. He turned and walked back into the house, his legs feeling weak beneath him. Inside, the silence was unbearable. Everything reminded him of Alice. Her schoolbooks were still scattered across the table, her sneakers left by the door. This had to be some terrible mistake. Alice couldn't possibly be guilty. At the police station, Alice sat in a cold, grey room, trembling. She had never been so scared in her life. The walls seemed to close in on her as she replayed the scene in her head. How had things gone so wrong? She thought about her father, how devastated he must be. Her thoughts drifted back to the life they had before this nightmare began. A life that, while simple, was filled with love. David, a gardener for the wealthy Murphy family, worked long hours, but he always came home with a tired smile, ready to spend time with his only daughter. Alice, a quiet and thoughtful girl of 12, often helped her father in the garden, marveling at the beauty of the flowers he tended. Their life was a peaceful rhythm, until that morning when everything changed. Now, that world felt like it was slipping away, replaced by cold walls and harsh accusations. Alice stared at her hands, still trembling slightly from the shock. She didn't understand how her world could turn upside down so fast. How could anyone believe she had stolen something? She hadn't even been near Mrs. Murphy's house that day. As she sat there, waiting for whatever would come next, Alice realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Alice sat at the cold metal table, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. The dim light hanging from the ceiling flickered slightly, casting long shadows that made the room feel even smaller than it was. Her heart raced, pounding against her ribs, as if it were trying to escape. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just hours ago she had been playing in the yard. Now she was in a police station, accused of something she didn't even understand. The door creaked open, and two officers walked in, one carrying a clipboard, the other taking a seat across from her. They didn't seem angry, just tired, like they had done this 100 times before and didn't expect anything different. "Alice," the officer with the clipboard said, glancing down at her name. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but that didn't ease her fear. "Do you know why you're here?" Alice's throat tightened. She had barely spoken since they arrested her. Her father's voice, pleading and desperate, still echoed in her ears. But now it was silent. She glanced at her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I didn't do anything." The officer set the clipboard down and leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning her face. "You're being accused of stealing a diamond from Mrs. Victoria Murphy's house, a very valuable one. Do you understand what that means?" Alice shook her head. "I didn't steal anything. I swear I didn't." The other officer, older and more serious-looking, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Look, Alice, we know your father works for the Murphys. We know you've been to the house before. People are saying they saw you near Mrs. Murphy's jewelry cabinet. This is serious. You need to tell us the truth." Alice's mind raced. She had been to the Murphy estate several times while her father worked, but she'd never gone near anything valuable. Mrs. Murphy scared her. She was always so cold, her gaze sharp like glass, making Alice uncomfortable every time they crossed paths. But steal from her? The thought was impossible. "I wasn't even near her jewelry cabinet," Alice said, her voice shaky. "I just stayed in the garden or sometimes in the kitchen when my dad was working. I didn't take anything." The officers exchanged a glance, not entirely convinced. The older one stood up and walked to the door. "We'll give you a few minutes to think. Maybe you'll remember something." As the door shut behind them, Alice felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. The accusation was so absurd, yet they were treating it like it was the truth. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the growing panic in her chest, but all she could think about was the last time she had been inside the Murphy mansion. It had been one of those rare days when Mrs. Murphy wasn't home. Alice had wandered into the house following the sound of her father's voice. She had never dared go inside before, but curiosity got the better of her. The mansion was vast, with cold marble floors and portraits of people she didn't know staring down at her from the walls. As she passed through the halls, something had caught her attention. A door slightly ajar. She peeked inside. That's when she saw them. Mrs. Murphy and a man she recognized from the family photos. Her brother, William. They were arguing, voices low but fierce. She couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the room was thick. And then Alice had run from the house that day, heart pounding, not daring to tell anyone what she'd seen. Her stomach churned at the thought. Meanwhile, miles away, Victoria Murphy sipped her wine in the dimly lit dining room of her mansion, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. She had planned this perfectly. No one would suspect her. And why would they? Alice was the perfect scapegoat, poor, defenseless, and easy to manipulate. As long as the girl kept her mouth shut about what she'd seen that day, Victoria's secret would stay buried. Back at the police station, Alice's father, David, was pacing outside the interrogation room, his heart heavy with worry. He had gone to every lawyer he could think of, but no one was willing to go up against Victoria Murphy. She had too much influence. It wasn't until he found John, a lawyer known for taking on cases for people with nothing left to lose, that he finally felt a glimmer of hope. But even then, he knew this was a battle they might not win. The courtroom buzzed with a hushed intensity, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. Journalists lined the walls, their cameras poised, ready to capture every movement, every flicker of emotion. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching at notepads as they exchanged glances, eager to capture the scandal of the moment. Alice's trial had gripped the town, and the courtroom was packed with faces she recognized but wished she didn't. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike had all come to see the spectacle unfold, to watch her life and her father's be dissected under the harsh light of the law. The news was filled with sensational headlines. A poor little girl thief challenges millionairess. Poverty and greed. The scandal that shakes high society. To everyone, Alice was already guilty, and the image of Victoria, the blameless victim, seemed unshakable. She was a master at manipulating the system to her advantage. Victoria Murphy entered the courtroom with the grace and poise of someone who knew the world revolved around her. Her polished heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound echoing in the large room as if announcing her arrival with an invisible fanfare. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high, her dark hair swept back in a severe style that only added to her cold demeanor. To everyone watching, Victoria seemed like the perfect picture of authority, control, and most of all, righteousness. She was, after all, the victim here. At least, that's how she had framed it. Alice sat quietly at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white from the pressure. She couldn't bring herself to look up. The weight of the stares, the whispers, pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Beside her, her lawyer, John, leaned in, whispering something, but his words were muffled by the pounding in her ears. Her heart raced, her palms damp with sweat. It all felt too big, too overwhelming. How had she ended up here, accused of a crime she didn't commit? She stole a glance at her father in the gallery. David sat near the back, his face etched with worry, though he tried to offer her a reassuring smile. It didn't help. Nothing could, not when Victoria Murphy was about to speak. "Mrs. Murphy," the prosecutor began, his voice smooth and calm, as though the outcome of this trial had already been decided. "Could you please tell the court what happened on the day of the theft?" Victoria nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "Of course," she said, her voice icy yet controlled. "I've known David and his daughter, Alice, for some time. I've always been generous, allowing David to bring her to the estate when he worked. She would help around the garden, or sometimes in the house under supervision. It was never a problem. Until that day." Her words hung in the air as though her generosity had been betrayed by the child sitting across from her. "That day," she continued, "I noticed something was off. After Alice left, I went to check my safe, and that's when I realized the diamond was missing." The courtroom collectively held its breath. Victoria's tone was clinical, almost indifferent, as if losing a diamond worth thousands was merely an inconvenience. "Did you see anyone else near the safe that day?" the prosecutor asked, glancing briefly at Alice as though already knowing the answer. "No," Victoria replied, shaking her head with just the right amount of conviction. The only person who had been in that part of the house was Alice. John shifted slightly beside Alice, his face neutral but eyes sharp. He leaned over, whispering again, "Stay calm, Alice." "This isn't over." Alice nodded, though her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Victoria continued her testimony, painting a perfect picture of herself as the benevolent employer who had been so horribly betrayed by the daughter of her loyal gardener. The way she spoke made it seem like Alice had planned the theft from the beginning, slipping into the mansion with the sole purpose of stealing that diamond. It was all so well rehearsed, each word placed with precision, designed to destroy whatever defense Alice might have. But then something shifted. "Mrs. Murphy," John stood, his voice calm but firm. "Just to clarify, you're saying Alice was the only person near your safe that day?" "That's correct," Victoria answered, her voice sharp. "And yet," John continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "isn't it true that the security cameras in your house malfunctioned that day? How is it possible that you can be so sure of Alice's presence when there's no visual proof?" Victoria hesitated, a flicker of something crossing her face. Her confident mask wavered for just a moment. "It was a coincidence," she replied stiffly. "The cameras aren't infallible. Technical issues happen." John nodded thoughtfully but didn't let up. "Of course, technology can fail, but let me ask you this. The safe was in your office, locked away behind a thick metal door. How could a 12-year-old girl open it?" Victoria replied, "Because she is the daughter of a gardener, poor people often know those tricks." Her answer, that discriminated between rich and poor, made many people angry. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time, doubt began to creep in. The whispers in the gallery had picked up again, soft murmurs of judgment. The courthouse was eerily quiet during the break, the tension hanging in the air thick enough to cut. Alice sat in the dimly lit hallway outside the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, fingers trembling slightly as she replayed the events of that night over and over in her head. It felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, a secret so heavy she could hardly breathe. She stared at the tiled floor, trying to block out the muffled murmurs of the crowd gathered beyond the doors. Reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers, all drawn to the spectacle of her trial, waiting eagerly for the next piece of the puzzle. But Alice wasn't thinking about the diamond anymore. No, her mind was stuck on something far more terrifying, something that had been gnawing at her since that terrible night. It had been late, just past dusk, when she was helping her father, David, in the garden of the Murphy estate. The air had been thick with the scent of roses, and the evening was peaceful, until it wasn't. Alice had wandered toward the side of the house, drawn by raised voices coming from inside. The argument was so heated, it pierced through the quiet like a knife. Victoria and her brother William were shouting, their words sharp and bitter. Alice had crouched by the window, barely daring to breathe, feeling the energy of the confrontation shift into something darker, more dangerous. She had seen William's face, twisted with fury, and Victoria's cold stare, like steel. And then it happened. One moment William was standing there pointing his finger in accusation, and the next he was crumpling to the ground. The sound of his fall had echoed in the room, heavy and final. For a long second everything had been still, as if the world had stopped. Alice's heart had pounded in her chest, her body frozen in shock. She had seen Victoria step over William's body, her face expressionless, as if nothing had happened. And then, without looking back, Victoria had walked out of the room, leaving William lying there, lifeless. Alice hadn't told anyone. She was terrified. Victoria was powerful and Alice was just a child. Who would believe her? But now, sitting in this hallway, waiting for the trial to resume, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. The truth about that night needed to come out. She looked up, finding John, her lawyer, pacing nearby. He had been trying his best to keep her calm throughout this nightmare, but she could see the strain in his face. Alice took a deep breath and stood up, her legs shaking. "John!" she called, her voice small but steady. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression softening. "What is it, Alice?" I need to tell you something." She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "It's about the night William died." John's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Go on." Alice swallowed hard, her heart thumping in her chest. "I saw them arguing. Victoria and William. It wasn't just a fight about money. It was about the company, the inheritance. She wanted everything. And then he fell." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and her hands started trembling again. "He fell, John, and she didn't help him. She just walked away." John was silent for a moment, processing her words. His face darkened as he realized the gravity of what she had just revealed. This wasn't just about the diamond anymore. The entire case could hinge on the truth behind William's death. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Alice?" John asked, his tone serious. "This could change everything." Alice nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure. I saw it happen." John sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "This is big, Alice. If you tell the court what you just told me, Victoria will fight back. She's not going to take this lying down." "I know," Alice whispered, her voice shaking. "But I have to tell the truth." John placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "You're brave, Alice. But this is going to be a battle." As the trial resumed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Alice sat in the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Victoria's icy gaze burning into her from across the room. But she didn't back down. She looked at the judge, her voice steady but quiet as she recounted the events of that night. The argument, William's fall, and the cold way Victoria had left him to die. The room fell silent, the weight of Alice's words hanging in the air. All eyes turned to Victoria, who sat stone-faced, her hands gripping the arms of her chair tightly. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. The courtroom was heavy with tension, the kind that clung to the walls and crept into the skin of everyone present. Victoria Murphy sat stiffly at the defense table, her chin raised in defiance. The once composed, commanding presence that had dominated the trial now seemed to waver, though she did her best to conceal it behind a cold, emotionless mask. Victoria had always been the master of her fate, or at least she believed she was. With her wealth, connections, and sharp intellect, she had manipulated people and events like a master chess player. Even now, accused of a crime so severe it could topple her empire, she remained confident that the truth wouldn't catch her. After all, who could challenge her? Who would dare? But then Laurier, her longtime housekeeper, had been called to the stand. The betrayal cut deeper than any accusation the prosecution could have conjured. Laurier, her trusted servant for years, had witnessed everything. Now she stood there, hands slightly trembling, her weathered face lined with both age and the weight of what she was about to confess. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating as Laurier began to speak, her voice thin but steady. "I was there the night William died." Victoria's eyes shot towards Laurier, a sharp glare, but Laurier continued, refusing to look at her. "I heard them arguing," Laurier said, her hands gripping the wooden rail before her as if for support. "It was late. Mr. William had just left the reading of Mr. Murphy's will. He was upset. No, they were upset." Her eyes flickered towards Victoria for a moment, but she quickly averted her gaze, looking down at the floor. "I didn't want to listen, but their voices were so loud." The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on her every word. Loria paused, her throat tightening. She swallowed hard before continuing. "They argued about the inheritance," she said softly. "Mr. William, he never wanted it. He was a gentle soul. He didn't care for the family business, but when he learned that 70% of the estate had been left to him instead of Mrs. Victoria, he didn't know what to do. He tried to explain that he didn't ask for it, that he would have given it all up if he could." Loria's voice broke slightly, and she quickly composed herself. "Mrs. Victoria," Loria said, "she was furious. She had worked by her father's side for years, running the company, making the decisions. She felt it was hers by right. She told Mr. William that he didn't deserve it, that he never cared about the family business, that he was weak and incompetent." Victoria's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the defense table. She hadn't said a word, but the tension radiating from her was palpable. The crowd in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Loria's words were unraveling Victoria's carefully constructed life, brick by brick. Loria's voice grew quieter, more haunted as she continued. "They were standing at the top of the staircase. I was at the bottom, listening from the hall. The shouting got louder, and then—" Loria faltered. For a moment, she seemed to lose her voice, her breath hitching. The judge, seeing her distress, gave her a nod to continue when she was ready. "Then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I saw it. Mrs. Victoria pushed him. It wasn't hard, just a shove in the heat of the moment, but it was enough. William lost his balance. And he fell." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. All eyes turned to Victoria, who sat frozen in her chair. For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her face, quickly replaced by cold fury. "That's a lie!" Victoria's voice rang out, sharp and venomous. She shot to her feet, pointing at Loria. "You're lying! I never touched him!" But the damage was done. The air in the courtroom shifted. It wasn't just a theft trial anymore. It was a trial about something much darker. William's death, once ruled an accident, now hung like a storm cloud over Victoria's head. And Loria was the lightning that would strike her down. Loria stood firm, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't know what to do," she continued, her voice shaking now. "She begged me to help cover it up. She promised me money, security for my family. She said no one would believe it was anything more than an accident." She swallowed hard, guilt weighing her down visibly. "I kept quiet, but I can't keep hiding the truth anymore, not after seeing that girl dragged into this mess." Victoria's face flushed with rage. "You liar!" she spat. "You're just trying to save yourself. None of this is true." The courtroom erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, everyone speaking at once. Reporters scrambled to take notes, the audience buzzed with shock. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but it was clear to everyone the real story was no longer about a diamond. The center of attention had shifted. It was about William's death, and whether Victoria had more blood on her hands than anyone had suspected. Loria, visibly shaken but resolute, stood her ground. Her betrayal wasn't one of revenge, but of guilt that had eaten away at her for too long. The truth was out, and there was no way to take it back. The courtroom was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that weighs heavy in the air, thick with expectation. Victoria Murphy sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling slightly, though she kept them hidden under the desk. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, on keeping the world in line with her desires. But today, that control was slipping. Her once stern face now showed cracks of desperation, a deep fear hiding behind her cold blue eyes. This was not how things were supposed to go. Loria, her longtime maid, stood in front of the judge, her head bowed slightly, wringing her hands nervously. She had worked for Victoria for over a decade, watching from the shadows as the Murphy family fell apart piece by piece. William's death had been the final blow. For months, Loria had stayed silent, convincing herself that it wasn't her place to interfere, and that Victoria would take care of her in return for her loyalty. But now, as she stood in the center of the courtroom, watching Alice, that innocent girl, being destroyed for a crime she didn't commit, Loria knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Loria's voice broke the silence, trembling as she spoke. I should have come forward sooner. Victoria shot her a sharp look, her lips tightening into a thin line. Loria felt that familiar chill run down her spine. The same one she had felt so many times working under Victoria's ruthless commands. But today was different. Today, Loria wouldn't be swayed by fear. Why didn't you? The prosecutor, John, asked gently, his voice steady. He already knew the answer, but wanted Loria to speak her truth. Loria's hands tightened into fists, her knuckles white. She promised me money, she admitted quietly, barely lifting her gaze. Victoria promised she'd take care of me, that I'd never have to worry about anything if I just kept quiet. John nodded, his eyes full of understanding. He had seen people like Loria before, caught in the webs of powerful figures like Victoria, too scared or too desperate to act. And why are you speaking now? Loria swallowed hard, her voice stronger this time. Because Alice didn't do anything wrong. I can't live with myself if I let this continue. Victoria's willing to destroy an innocent girl's life, just to protect herself. Her eyes darted to Alice, who sat quietly beside her father, eyes wide with confusion and fear. That's not right. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Loria, are you saying that you have new evidence to present to this court? Loria nodded shakily, her heart racing. She had debated for days whether or not to hand it over, the one piece of proof she had kept hidden. But the guilt had been too much to bear. Reaching into her purse, her hands shaking, she pulled out a small, old-fashioned tape recorder. I recorded something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's eyes widened with horror. Loria, she hissed, her voice sharp as glass. What are you doing? But Loria didn't flinch this time. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. John took the recorder from Loria's hands, glancing briefly at the judge before playing it for the courtroom to hear. The tape crackled, the sound fuzzy at first, and then, unmistakably, Victoria's voice rang out. William, don't you dare cross me. You think you can just take everything? You think you can just walk away with my inheritance? I swear if you don't stop, you'll regret it. There was a long pause on the tape, followed by a loud thud, as though something heavy had fallen to the floor. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the shock rippling through the room like a wave. Everyone turned to look at Victoria, her face pale, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. That recording was made the night William died, John said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a knife. It's clear that this wasn't an accident. Mrs. Murphy threatened her own brother, and moments later, he was dead. Victoria didn't try to help him. She didn't call 911. She let him die. And then she asked Loria to help her cover it all up, to make sure it looked like an accident. All of this, the diamond case, the accusation against Alice, was all part of her plan to divert attention from what really happened. Victoria stood abruptly, knocking her chair over in her haste. This is nonsense, lies, all of it, she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. but not from regret, but from rage and terror. She knew Loria had just sealed her fate. Her betrayal had been the final blow, and there was nothing Victoria could do to stop it. "No!" Victoria screamed, her voice breaking. "You're lying, you fucking traitor!" The judge slammed the gavel down hard, calling for silence. But there was no turning back now. Victoria, the woman who had controlled everything for so long, was watching her empire of lies crumble before her eyes. The courtroom was filled with murmurs after Loria's revelation. Victoria Murphy, who had maintained an impeccable facade throughout the trial, was now completely broken. Her screams echoed through the courtroom as she tried to defend herself. But her words were an empty echo, shrouded in the fear of her impending downfall. Alice, sitting next to her lawyer, watched in silence. Victoria's fury and desperation filled her with a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew that the truth, the one she had carried inside her for so long, was finally coming to light. But the depth of the darkness surrounding Victoria and her family was overwhelming her. "Loria, you pathetic, how dare you!" But it was too late. The evidence was there, undeniable and damning. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Order in the court!" Victoria's chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to regain control, her eyes darting wildly around the room. But the faces staring back at her were no longer filled with respect or fear. They saw her for what she truly was now, a woman who had killed her own brother over greed and tried to pin it on an innocent girl. Judge leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Victoria, who had now stopped screaming and was sobbing silently, aware that her mask had fallen. "Mrs. Murphy, the court has heard enough evidence against you," the judge said in a voice that seemed to cut through the air. "Your made testimony is clear. The evidence presented by the defense has shown that this child, Alice, was used as a distraction to cover up your brother's death. We cannot continue this farce." Her hands trembled as they cuffed her wrists, and she looked around, searching for something, anything, to save her. But there was nothing left. As she was led out of the courtroom, her eyes met Loria's one last time. Victoria's face twisted in anger and betrayal. "You'll regret this," she spat, but Loria didn't look away. She stood tall, her guilt slowly lifting as Victoria was taken away. The courthouse doors creaked open, letting in a flood of sunlight that felt too harsh, too glaring for what had just transpired inside. Alice and her father, David, stepped into the chaos of cameras, microphones, and a sea of reporters pressing in on them from every side. Alice blinked against the flashing lights, her small hand gripping tightly onto her father's as they tried to navigate the crowd. She had been cleared of all charges, but the weight of the ordeal still clung to her like a heavy fog, making it hard to breathe. "Alice! Alice! How do you feel now that you've been proven innocent?" one reporter shouted, shoving a microphone towards her face. David held up his hand, shielding his daughter from the barrage. "No more questions. Please let us be," he muttered, his voice firm but laced with exhaustion. They pushed through the throng, step by weary step, until they finally reached the car waiting for them. David opened the door and helped Alice in, his hand lingering for a moment on her shoulder before closing the door behind her. He paused before getting into the driver's seat, taking a deep breath as he glanced back at the courthouse, the press still swarming like vultures. The car pulled away, leaving the courthouse and the noise behind. But inside the car, the silence was deafening. Alice stared out the window, watching the city blur past, but her mind was elsewhere, back in that cold courtroom, reliving every painful moment. The accusations, the trial, the humiliation. She had been innocent all along, but that didn't change how the world had seen her. That didn't change how they had treated her. David broke the silence first. "We're going home now," he said softly. "It's over, Alice." But Alice wasn't sure if it was really over. The verdict had cleared her name, yes, but it hadn't erased the looks, the whispers, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She turned to her father, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it, though?" David glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing. He didn't have an answer, and in that silence they both knew that some wounds didn't heal just because a judge said they could go free. When they reached home, the house looked the same, small, worn around the edges, but still their home. Yet it felt different now, like the walls had shifted, like something essential had been broken and couldn't be put back together. Alice walked in slowly, looking around at the familiar surroundings. Her books were still on the shelf, the old blanket she always curled up with still draped over the couch. But none of it felt real anymore. Later that evening, a knock on the door broke the stillness. David opened it to find Phillips Murphy, Victoria Murphy's son, standing there. He looked uncomfortable, as though he'd rather be anywhere else, but there was a seriousness in his expression that made David pause. "I heard about what happened," Phillips began, his voice low, avoiding David's eyes at first. "I wanted to come by and, I don't know, say something. Apologize, I guess." David stood there, unsure of how to respond, but Alice appeared in the doorway behind him, her presence quiet but steady. She looked at Phillips, remembering how he'd sat through the trial, silent, watching his mother unravel as the truth came out. Phillips cleared his throat, finally meeting Alice's gaze. "My mother, she did horrible things, and I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix any of it. But now that the estate, the inheritance is in my hands, I want to do something right." He shifted awkwardly, pulling out an envelope. It's not enough. It'll never be enough for what you've been through. But I want to give you a part of what's been left to me. It's a small way of saying I'm sorry for everything you've had to suffer." Alice looked at the envelope in his hand, her emotions swirling. She wasn't sure how to feel. Money couldn't fix what had happened to her. It couldn't erase the fear, the shame, the betrayal. And yet, Phillips wasn't responsible for his mother's actions. He was trying to make amends in the only way he knew how. David reached out and took the envelope for Alice, nodding once. "Thank you," he said quietly. After Phillips left, Alice sat in silence, the envelope untouched on the table in front of her. She thought about the trial, the way everyone had looked at her as if she were already guilty. No amount of money could ever make her forget that. But she also knew that the truth had come out in the end, and that was worth something. Maybe not enough to heal completely, but enough to start moving forward. Later that night, as Alice lay in her bed, she realized something had shifted inside her. The pain was still there, yes, but there was also relief that she no longer had to carry the weight of someone else's lies. The truth had set her free, even if it had come at a high cost. In the quiet darkness of her room, Alice closed her eyes, knowing that life wouldn't return to what it had been. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't need to. It was hard to forget the cold stares, the whispers of doubt, and the harsh reality that her life, once simple and filled with moments of quiet happiness, would never be the same. Everything had changed after those dark days, when she was wrongly accused of stealing the diamond from Victoria Murphy. The weight of that injustice had crushed her spirit, but now, as she stood at the threshold of a new chapter, Alice felt a deep shift within herself. She wasn't the same girl who had been dragged from her home, terrified and confused. The trials of the past months had changed her, hardened her in some ways, but also opened her eyes to the true meaning of strength. Standing in the doorway of their small but cozy house, Alice watched her father, David, watering the few plants they had in their tiny front yard. He moved with a deliberate calmness, his hands gentle with the plants, the same way they had been with her all these years. The garden reminded Alice of the life they once had before everything went wrong, simple, honest, and full of quiet joys. But now, there was something more in their lives, an understanding that only comes after facing hardship and surviving it. David glanced up, noticing his daughter's thoughtful expression. "Everything okay, kiddo?" Alice nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, Dad. Just thinking." She stepped out into the soft evening light, her shoes crunching against the gravel pathway. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh flowers, reminders of the peaceful life they were working so hard to rebuild. For months, Alice had been trapped in a nightmare, but now, with the court's ruling behind them, there was finally room to breathe again. Her father had used part of the compensation they received from the Murphy family to rebuild their lives, but Alice had different plans for her future. "I was thinking," Alice began, her voice quieter now, "maybe we could do something good with that money." David looked up from the plants, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you have in mind?" Alice hesitated, but she had been mulling this over for weeks now, ever since the trial ended and the dust had settled. "We could use it to help kids like me, ones who are going through tough stuff and don't have anyone to stand up for them." Her father studied her for a long moment, pride swelling in his chest. She had changed so much over the past few months. The bright-eyed innocence she once carried had dimmed, replaced by a quiet resolve. She wasn't the same girl who used to spend her afternoons playing without a care in the world. The injustice she had faced had forced her to grow up too soon, but instead of being hardened by it, Alice had become stronger, more compassionate. "That's a big idea, Alice," David said slowly, leaning on his watering can. "But it's a good one. I just feel like we've been through so much, and there are other kids out there who don't have a dad like you, or someone like John to help them," Alice explained. Her thoughts drifted back to John, their lawyer, who had fought tirelessly to prove her innocence. He had been the one to suggest that they share their story, to encourage others who felt powerless or wronged by the system to keep fighting. Alice hadn't understood it at first, why their pain could be used for something positive, but now it made sense. "It's not fair what happened to us, but maybe we can make it right for someone else." David nodded, his eyes softening with pride. "You're right. We could make a real difference." For the first time in a long while, Alice felt hopeful. The dark cloud that had hung over their lives was finally lifting. She and her father had been through hell, but they had come out on the other side, not as victims, but as survivors. Now they had the power to help others who were still trapped in their own nightmares. In the days that followed, Alice and her father began working on their plan. They contacted local charities, offering donations to support children in need, those who had been abandoned, wrongfully accused, or simply forgotten. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For Alice, it was a way to turn her pain into something meaningful, to give back to those who needed it most. One afternoon, while sitting by the window, Alice wrote a letter, a message to anyone who had ever felt powerless or silenced. It was a simple message, but one that she knew from experience could change lives. "Never stop fighting for the truth," she wrote. "Even when it feels like no one believes you and the world is against you, there is always hope, always a way to make things right. Don't let the lies define you. Stand up for yourself and for those who can't stand up for themselves." As Alice folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey had been hard, and the road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time she felt truly free. The truth had set her free, and now it was time to help others find their own freedom too. Thank you all for following Alice's story and the emotional journey she and her father went through. After all the pain and challenges, the truth finally prevailed. It didn't just bring justice to Alice, but also allowed her and her father to bring hope to others who have been wronged. This is a clear reminder that no matter how difficult things get, perseverance in the pursuit of justice will always bring light to those brave enough to stand up. If this story touched you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that they're never alone in their fight for justice. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Each of us has hidden strength, and as Alice has shown, it's important to never give up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep believing and always move forward.